The wind moved like an old spirit across the high desert as rancher Cole Harrow rode the fence line that morning, his hat low, his thoughts lower, wondering how many more mistakes a man could survive before the land swallowed him whole. And it was that same wind that carried the faintest sound, half whisper, half wounded breath, that made him pull the reins and turn his ear toward the cottonwoods near the dry creek bed, a place he hadn't ridden in months, the place he avoided because memories hung there like forgotten ropes. Cole nudged his horse down the slope, every instinct telling him to leave whatever he heard to fate, because the West punished curiosity harder than sin itself. But something deeper, something old and stubborn inside him, pushed him forward until he saw a shape lying motionless near the roots of the biggest tree. A bundle wrapped in a rough wool blanket, tied with rope, as if someone had tossed a life aside the way ranch hands toss grain sacks after winter. Cole dismounted slowly, boots sinking into the brittle earth, his pulse tightening with each step, and when he crouched beside the bundle he felt the warmth of breath beneath the fabric, soft but trembling, and then a faint voice escaped from within, a voice worn thin by fear and exhaustion, whispering, "Just kill me fast." Cole froze, his hand halfway to the knot in the blanket, because no human voice should carry that kind of resignation unless they'd been dragged through hell and left behind to wait for its slow return. And for a long moment he didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at the bundle with that familiar dread he thought he'd buried years ago. He said her name, not knowing why he chose the wrong name first, maybe a ghost from his past, but the voice didn't answer, only flinched ever so slightly, as if even the sound of hope hurt. With a steadying breath, Cole loosened the first knot, fingers trembling more than he wanted to admit, and pulled the blanket back, expecting to find someone on the edge of life but not prepared for the truth that stared up at him. The young woman beneath the blanket had the look of someone who had survived too much with too little strength left, dust clinging to her skin, her arms marked by the desperate story of someone who'd fought to stay alive, her face weary in that quiet, hollow way that comes only when the world has taken more than it ever gave. But it wasn't the wounds or her condition that made Cole stumble backward into the dirt. It was her eyes, not their color, but the recognition in them, as though she knew, as though she carried a piece of his past he'd never shared with another soul. She tried to rise, but couldn't, her hands barely lifting before falling again, and tried to speak, but only managed a broken whisper that cracked something inside him. Don't let them take me back!" Cole swallowed hard, because that plea was no simple fear. It was the kind of plea a person makes after witnessing something they'll never unsee, something carved into their minds so deep that death seems like a softer road. He reached out carefully, letting her see his hands first, the way he would approach a skittish horse, speaking low, steady, the way his father once taught him when dealing with a creature more scared than dangerous. "You're safe," he said, though he didn't know if it was true. Not out here, not with the tracks he now noticed in the dirt, hoofprints circling like wolves around prey, fresh enough to mean whoever left her hadn't gone far. His ranch sat miles beyond the ridgeline, but miles meant nothing if danger had a horse and a grudge, and Cole felt the old instincts prickling at the back of his neck, telling him he was standing at the edge of something bigger than one wounded stranger, something tangled with threads of fate he'd been trying to outrun for years. When he lifted her gently, she winced but didn't cry out, her breath sharp, her strength draining as she leaned against him, and he wondered what kind of fear could force a person to ask a stranger for a quick death rather than a fighting chance. He draped the blanket around her shoulders, trying to shield her from the sun, though he knew the real danger wasn't the heat. It was the men who had tied her up and ridden off with the confidence of those who believed no one would care enough to untie her. Cole placed her on his horse, mounting behind her so she wouldn't fall, and rode toward his ranch with the caution of a man who knew he was already too late to avoid the storm that had begun the moment he loosened that knot. Her head rested weakly against his shoulder, her breath uneven, her voice fading in and out like an echo trying to hold on to the present. And she said something, just one quiet phrase he could barely make out, something that tightened every muscle in his body and made the world tilt under him. "They think you have it." Cole didn't know what she meant, but the words carried weight, the kind that could get a man killed at sunrise, and he stared across the flat, shimmering land, feeling the old West closing in on him, drawing its invisible circle around a destiny he hadn't asked for. When they reached the ranch yard, the shadows were already growing long, stretching across the dirt like the reach of something unseen, and before he could lift her down, she gripped his shirt with what little strength she had, her eyes wide with the urgency of someone who knew time was running out. Don't open the blanket again, she whispered. Not until you're ready. Cole felt a chill sweep through him because he had already opened it. He had already seen her, but clearly there was something else. Something he had overlooked in his shock. Something still hidden within the folds of that rough wool, wrapping her like a cocoon of unfinished truth. He carried her inside the barn for shelter, laying her carefully in the hay, the afternoon light dimming around them, dust motes drifting like silent witnesses. And as he stepped back, he noticed a shape beneath the blanket he hadn't seen before. Small, firm, something tucked near her side. He reached toward it just to confirm it wasn't his imagination, but before his fingers touched the fabric, she forced her voice out again, sharp with fear, stopping him cold. Cole, don't! Not now! And in that moment, with the sun slipping below the ridge and the horses growing restless as if sensing an unseen presence nearing the ranch, Cole Harrow realized he wasn't just sheltering a stranger. He was standing at the threshold of a secret powerful enough to draw blood. A secret others were already willing to kill for. And whatever waited beneath that blanket had the strength to change the course of his life forever. Night settled over the Harrow ranch like a heavy blanket, stitched with old omens. And Cole could feel the land holding its breath as he lit a single lantern inside the barn, the glow flickering across the young woman lying in the hay. Her eyes half open, but alert enough to watch every shadow that moved, as if danger itself had learned how to walk on silent boots. Outside, the horses paced anxiously, their breaths sharp, their hooves restless, against the packed dirt, sensing what the night carried long before any man could. And Cole, the man who once swore he'd live quiet and die quieter, knew he was already part of whatever storm fate was pushing toward him. The girl stirred, her voice barely a whisper as she asked for water, and when he brought it to her, she held the cup weakly, the lantern light revealing a strange kind of determination beneath all that exhaustion, as though she had lived long enough with fear to no longer fear anything except silence itself. "My name's Mara," she said after a long pause, the words cracking like brittle firewood. And she told him she had once worked at a remote homestead north of the ridge, a place where trust grew slowly but danger grew faster, and where a group of riders, men she didn't fully see, had come searching for something they claimed was stolen from them. Cole felt a knot forming in his chest because her next words came with the weight of someone who knew her truth could drag others into the dark. "They believe the thief brought it to you." Cole shook his head slowly, his voice steady despite the pulse hammering behind it, swearing he didn't know what she was talking about. But Mara cut him off gently, sadness rising in her eyes like a slow, painful dawn. "It's in the blanket," she whispered, and Cole froze, remembering the shape he'd felt earlier, the one she'd warned him not to touch until the right moment. The barn door rattled suddenly, hard enough to make dust drift from the rafters, and Cole extinguished the lantern in one quick motion, instinct guiding his hands the way his father's lessons once guided his aim. The ranch yard fell silent again, but only for a heartbeat, and then a low murmur of distant voices carried on the wind. Voices searching, voices hunting. Mara tensed, clutching the blanket tighter around herself, her breathing rough, her fear no longer hidden. And Cole stepped toward the barn window, peering out just enough to see silhouettes moving against the moonlit earth. 3 riders, maybe 4, moving slow, cautious, as though they already suspected the truth. Cole returned to her side, his voice low, controlled, promising he wouldn't let anyone take her. But she shook her head with a bitter smile that carried years of pain. "They're not after me," she said softly. "They're after what's under this blanket, and they'll burn your whole ranch to ash if they think you're hiding it." Cole swallowed hard, the West's old cruelty tightening around his ribs. But he finally nodded, knowing destiny never asked permission before changing a man's life. With a steady breath, he pulled the blanket aside just enough to see the object tucked against Mara's side. A small, leather-bound lockbox with iron corners, heavy for its size. Old enough to look like it came from a different world entirely. The kind of thing men killed for without ever knowing the truth of what they were chasing. "I didn't steal it," Mara whispered, reading the question in his eyes. "I found it buried behind the Dawson outpost, and I was a fool to open it." She didn't say what she'd seen inside, only that it wasn't money, wasn't gold, wasn't anything that should matter to violent men, yet somehow it mattered more than anything else on this side of the desert. Cole didn't press further because her voice carried the finality of someone who had already said more than she should. Outside, the riders dismounted, boots crunching on dry soil, and Cole felt time collapse into a single moment where every choice he had ever made, every mistake he had tried to outrun, came circling back like weary ghosts, asking if he was ready to answer for them. He lifted Mara carefully, guiding her toward the narrow storage loft above the tack room, a hidden space no stranger would ever find without luck or divine intervention. And once she was settled, he placed the lockbox beside her and whispered a promise he intended to keep, even if it meant burying the night with his own hands. The barn door creaked open without warning, lantern lights sweeping across the entry as two of the riders stepped inside, their faces shadowed beneath wide brims, their voices cold and rehearsed, asking if Cole Harrow had seen a young woman or any travelers passing through recently. Cole stood squarely in the center of the barn, arms crossed, expression carved from the same stone that built the West, and answered with the calm certainty of a man who'd faced down storms bigger than any outlaw. Before him, when they demanded to search the barn, Cole refused politely at first, then firmly, then with a final edge that made it clear he'd die before yielding, and after a tense silence so long it felt like a lifetime stretched tight. The riders exchanged looks, muttered curses, and rode off into the night. Not convinced, but not ready for a gunfight either. Only when their silhouettes faded into the dark did Cole climb back to the loft, finding Mara clutching the lockbox as if it were both her salvation and her curse, tears pooling in her eyes, not of fear, but of relief, of disbelief that someone had stood for her when so many had turned away. Cole sat beside her, the night air drifting through broken boards, stars burning high above them like watchful eyes, and Mara finally told him the truth. Inside the lockbox was a ledger detailing the names of every ranch, every family, every piece of land the riders intended to seize by force under the guise of false claims and forged deeds. A blueprint for a new empire of fear that would swallow the entire valley if no one stopped it. Cole's jaw tightened, the same fire that once made him a respected rancher, before grief nearly hollowed him out, now rising with renewed purpose. He knew the West had always been a place where men drew their lines in dust, where some lines faded and others lasted forever, and in that moment he understood the line he needed to draw. By sunrise, Mara slept peacefully for the first time in days, the lockbox secured beside her, and Cole saddled his horse quietly, preparing for the long ride to the territorial marshal's post, where truth still had a chance to change the world. He paused before leaving, watching the morning light brush the barn with gold, knowing that meeting Mara had been no accident. That fate had guided him to her so he could face the destiny he'd been avoiding since the day he lost everything. As he rode out through the open gate, coat whipping behind him in the cold dawn wind, Cole felt the weight of responsibility turn into something steadier, something stronger, and he whispered a silent vow that whatever the West demanded of him next, he would not turn away. And for those hearing this tale across the dusty trails of time, riding the long road of their own lives, Cole Harrow's story reminds us all that courage begins the moment a person chooses to stand for someone else. And if you want more stories shaped by fate, grit, and the untamed heart of the frontier, hit that subscribe button so you never miss another ride with Western Destiny Tales.